I'm Dennis Anderson along with Julie Zenner, and here's what's coming up on Almanac North.
Opioid addiction is a growing problem. We'll talk with the producers of WDSE's new Opioid series to see what they've learned about this scourge.
And we'll have part 2 of our exclusive interview with Minnesota's new governor, Tim Walz. Tonight he talks about copper mines, pipelines, and more.
And we'll have the week's top business stories from Business North.
These stories and much more next on Almanac North. Well, hello again and welcome to Almanac North. Thank you very much for watching. And Julie, looks like we're going to be dropping down into the deep freeze. Highs this weekend might not get above 0.
In other words, it's going to be just a typical Duluth winter day.
We're going to enjoy it. Okay. Well, we've got some important topics tonight.
All right. Thank you, Denny, and welcome everyone. Opioid addiction may be one of the greatest health emergencies in our lifetime. Thousands of Northland residents have been touched in some ways by this epidemic. WDSE commissioned a 6-part series to get to the heart of this growing problem. The series Opioids, Crisis in the Northland is an eye-opening look at the toll this addiction is having on society. Here's a video clip from part 1 of the series.
Truly, I believe this is the public health crisis of my lifetime, you know. Not just because of Ben, but because of what we see, you know, day to day in the emergency department or, you know, down the road at CADT.
You know, that sense of isolation and stoic, rural, northern Minnesota, the ability to be able to reach out and to share or to say I'm in trouble or I need some help. Like that is not something that has ever come easy.
Joining us now are the series producers, Ramona Marozas and Rob Sidenberg III. And thanks so much for being here, and congratulations on a really outstanding project. The two of you did a fabulous job.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was really, the people did the work in this case. We were just there capturing the story.
Well, you can say that, but I know that there's a lot of work that goes into it. And so maybe, Ramona, you can start out by talking about how you even started to approach a problem that's this big and this complex.
Well, certainly the WDSE WRPT, we held an Essentia-sponsored town hall meeting, and we knew we wanted the big players in the community who work to fight this epidemic every day, and that was the Duluth Police Chief, the lieutenant of the drug task force. We had the St. Louis County Attorney and an Essentia toxicologist, the only toxicologist in our region, and getting their perspectives that was the start.
Yeah.
And then they connected us with, you know, Greg Anderson from Social Services, who then connected us with these people. And then I had a friend who lost her brother, and then she connected us with her mother, and then we were connected with this woman who her fiance died from an opioid overdose, and she found out she was pregnant with his child after he died.
Robert, have you discovered in all the research you did for this series, is the opioid crisis worsening, or are we getting a handle on this?
I'd say we're getting a handle on it, but it's complicated. It's not quite black and white. It's not quite better, worse. The numbers are shifting slightly, but it's still ugly. I mean, we're to the point where our national life expectancy has dropped for 2 years in a row, and a major contributor to that is opioid overdoses. I mean, that's how we know we've got a severe problem here. And so when we approach this topic, it's huge and complicated and comes down to the fundamentals of addiction even. And the way that we thought that the best approach would be was the human side. We've got a community here. And that's the only way that we can combat this and actually improve it. And we're seeing that. That's the litmus that we can rely upon, is that we're seeing action. We're seeing people care about it. We received many communications from people who wanted to be heard, want to start something, want to get together and talk.
In every case of addiction, whole families are affected, are they not?
Yeah, it's Gary Olson said he was the former CEO of the Center for Alcohol and Drug Treatment Center up here, said that, families of opioid users are really crime victims. I mean, it's essentially that. You've lost a loved one. You're being impacted by an outside force. And anyone that's suffering through substance use disorder doesn't want to be addicted. No one would wish this on their worst enemy.
Ramona, what do you see as driving the crisis in our region specifically? Are there any local issues or conditions that make it any worse or better than what people are seeing in other parts of the country?
Initially, we really wanted to hit home. The Northland is this isolated area, and it is extremely freezing, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show. The experts couldn't really touch exactly on that being the driving force behind it being so bad up here, but St. Louis County does have the highest rates of opioid overdoses per capita compared to other counties across Minnesota. And we spoke with St. Luke's doctor in the emergency department who said, in St. Louis County particularly, prescriptions were being over-prescribed at a very, very high level, even compared to other counties.
Is the medical community, Ramona, taking some blame for this?
100%, and they would say, accountability, that they're taking accountability along with everybody. All the players in this need to take accountability. Like Representative Liz Olson said, we all have to do our part in the solution because so many different people helped get us where as bad as it is today, like the doctors, the pharmaceutical companies. And Rob, you can touch on the Purdue and how they were pretty much setting the standards for pain.
Yeah, I mean, they started treating pain like another vital sign. And that's the really ugly side of it, is that dollars became more important than human lives. And doctors were expected to prescribe, expected to treat pain differently. And, that beget that chart that you might have seen at your doctor's office of the smiley faces.
Right.
How very childlike they created that and they would prescribe at very low levels of pain. For any sort of ailment, they'd prescribe a month or 2 months worth of pills. Well, they were also fed information that these were not addictive, that this was this magic pill. And for some people, it's great. And it's great at what it does. It does treat pain. It does treat pain really well. But for some people, it's that click. And it's probably the worst addiction there is. And here in the Northland, I think we've got a breeding ground for it. It's in our nature to be self-sufficient, to not seek help oftentimes, and to not talk. And that's something that we wanted to combat.
Stigma.
Is get that the stigma is awful, and so get people talking about it. There's no shame in it. There's no shame in should you be shamed if you're diabetic? Should you be shamed if you struggle with anxiety? No, absolutely not. Substance use disorder is very much the same. We're starting to see that attitude change, and so that was really enlightening and hopeful too. When talking with police officers and Lieutenant Kazel too. He's passionate and he's humane about it. These are people who are suffering, and they're not looking to punish people. They're looking to punish the people that take advantage of those people.
It sounds like you didn't have much trouble finding people who wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, the stigma must be reduced a little bit. What struck you the most as you learned these firsthand stories from people who either had gone through the addiction themselves or had lived through it with a loved one?
I would say for me it was, my own opinions being crashed down, maybe I thought, what I initially thought of methadone, it's treating a drug addiction with another drug, but it's very supported within the medical community from at least the doctors that we spoke with. And then harm reduction that, we have in Duluth, Clean Needle Exchange Network. I thought, the medical industry and the pharmacists we spoke with, I assumed they would be totally against it. They supported it, and my mind was blown.
So how should the larger community respond to this?
I mean, the simple steps are just
Coming together, community.
I mean, that's just it. We can beat this with our community, and something as simple as be kind always. We're all fighting a battle that no one knows about, and recognizing things, not being afraid to address things. Talking to your legislators too, for that matter, because they're now crafting legislation that's going to be impacting our communities directly.
Are drug courts helping?
We
Yes.
spoke with one woman who said drug courts saved her life. We spoke with another woman who said she utilized drug courts because she wanted to get out of jail and get high again. So I think it depends on the person.
Yeah.
I think really, we've heard a lot of times people will go through treatment, people will try to get better, but it really has to be that person that wants it. And the community support is crucial.
That's really it. And when people go through treatment, and then they go back to use, it's not a failure of the person. It's a failure of the treatment. And so essentially when somebody goes through treatment and gets to a place of sobriety, surrounding the community surrounding them, being willing to give them a job, give them a chance. This isn't a person who's flawed. This is a person who has struggled with something and is doing hard work. And so I think as an average citizen, just being cognizant of that these are just people struggling, and this is human life, and so many lost loved ones in this, and almost every one of us is one click away from someone who's struggling with it. Both Ramona and I have personal connections with people who have struggled, and it was powerful. And going through all this footage, I don't know how many just
30. We interviewed
heart-wrenching
over 30
stories,
people.
right? And everyone cares though, and I think that's the biggest is stop ignoring it.
Yeah.
We've gotten this place together, and we can get back out of it too. And that was the positive that we heard from multiple people, is that Duluth really is a wonderful community and a supportive community, and it's ready to step up and fight this problem.
So there are 6 episodes. We have a graphic that shows what they are. Just walk us through quickly what people see and learn in the series. And we only have about a minute, so it's got to be the short course.
We'll go back and forth. First one, tracing an epidemic, the roots of use and abuse.
And then it's stories of addiction, and those are, tales of loved ones who have struggled with substance use and the fundamentals of addiction too.
Treatment, how do we judge what works?
Law and addiction, and there we involve, crime and addiction and how it's treated.
The case, we looked at legislation to combat the issue, and also St. Louis County is one of several across the country who are currently in a lawsuit right now against opioid manufacturers.
And finally, solutions, just as we've talked about, and it's conversation. It's thank you again for having us on. Thank you for airing this on WDSE, and thank you to all the people involved. The solution really is conversation in our community coming.
And there are resources out there to help
Yes.
people, aren't there? Where do they find those resources?
WDSE.org.
Yep.
We definitely
Have a whole wealth of resources available to look online, but ask around. There's resources. ORS is a great community-involved group that started up too. So there are lots of resources these days, whereas there wasn't before.
We have a new website coming for this, so that will have all of that.
Thanks for doing the
All
series.
right. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Good work and an important conversation for the community. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Last week, Minnesota's new governor, Democrat Tim Walz, was in Duluth to celebrate his inauguration. While he was in town, we sat down with him for an exclusive interview. In part 2 of that interview, we asked the governor about his choice for DNR commissioner. Sarah Strawman is a former policy director for Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, a group that is against copper mining in northern Minnesota.
Well, first of all, I don't think I would characterize them as anti-mining group. I think I would characterize them as an environmental group, just like I wouldn't certainly consider pro-mining groups be anti-boundary waters. I would say a lot of those folks would consider themselves as friends of the boundary waters because they paddle in that. And I think what they should be looking at is that we're hiring people that are following the philosophy that I've laid out. We follow the science, we follow the permitting, we make sure that when we're putting things in place that there is liability protections for the states, and that the state is always there to monitor in partnership. And what I've said is if these projects, like PolyMed has come through about a 12 to 14 year process, if they can meet these things done, then we should do it. I will have to say I'm concerned when we see anything to try and go around to cut off some of those. The situation at Twin Metals, I disagreed with President Trump's decision to kind of short circuit the environmental side of that. So I think you can see a consistency. I think DNR Commissioner Storman has been an adamant supporter of the outdoors, but is also a long track record of following procedures and trying to strike that proper balance on economic growth and opportunities with our natural resources as well as the environment.
The other maybe controversial issue right now in northern Minnesota is Enbridge's pipeline, Line 3. Where is your administration on that right now?
Again, I would say those same principles follow true. Look at the science, look at the permitting processes. The one thing I would add amongst all these is meaningful consultation by the people who are impacted. This is especially true with our sovereign nations. We have an added responsibility with our 11 sovereign nations to work in partnership with them as nation-to-nation negotiations. We know that Enbridge has started to do that with Fond du Lac, and some of them we're starting to see some agreements. I would encourage them to keep going on that. And I know this is a highly controversial issue, but what I ask people is that this is another process that it's been in the process. There are checks and balances to look at that. We are now first week into our administration to give us an opportunity to look at where some of these things are at and to try and build the coalition necessary to look at, is this first and foremost a necessary project? Can it be done in a safe manner? Is it being done in consultation with the people that are impacting it? And what are the risks to both environment, people, and our economy? And that's what we're in the process right now. I have said this at the federal level. I sat for many years on the House Transportation Committee and sat on the Pipelines and Hazardous Waste Committee. We have about 2.4 million miles of pipelines under our lands right now. They're aging, some of them, just like Line 3. We need to be smart about that. Some products, it makes a lot more sense to run through pipelines than it does through rail cars because of the safety of it. The Line 3 project, I think it gets passions up because it starts to enter into an area that I'm deeply concerned about too, is climate change and dependence on fossil fuels. So my pledge to the people of Minnesota is to be deliberate in our thinking, to follow the science, to follow the permitting, and to be transparent in how we talk about this. And I'm sure on an issue like this, there are going to be those that are disappointed on either way we go. But I was elected by the people of Minnesota to try and bring in the best people to find that answer.
One of the things you campaigned about and talked about during your campaign was the idea of legalizing recreational marijuana. What do you think the odds of that happening in the current legislative setup?
You know, it's hard for me to predict on the House side. We're certainly focusing on, we made it around family economic security, education, healthcare, and certainly community prosperity, but we can walk and chew gum. And I've come to this conclusion on several things. I was the author of the only piece of legislation in American history on cannabis reform to ever pass a committee in the House dealing with research into medicinal cannabis for veterans. But I come to this position because I recognize prohibition does not work. I think it just makes more sense to have a good regulatory procedures in place, an education piece that goes with it, and then the taxation. We're seeing in places like Colorado, they had about a $200 million increase in education funding in a state that is the same size as Minnesota. It's fairly significant. I think it helps us then to educate, and those who say, you're giving in, I certainly also come from this as a position on this is, there's a lot of racial disparities in people who are incarcerated because of marijuana, and I think it's getting that fixed. I also think whether it be legalized gambling, whether it be alcohol, tobacco, and things, Whether you see these as vices, I trust adults to make decisions about their own life, and I think in a broader picture of this is that cannabis legalization just makes more sense. It brings more order to it. I think there's an opportunity to bring that into a much more manageable piece than it is right now, because again, it's a false choice to say, well, you're legalizing this and all these things are going to happen. It's for sale right now. It's simply for sale in a black market that creates racial disparities in incarceration, creates violence in terms of the trafficking, where you could make this much more above board.
Your first official act this week was to form the One Minnesota Council on Increasing Diversity in State Hiring. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and it extends beyond that hiring and procurement, but also in how we do projects, so we're looking about it. And I talk to people about One Minnesota, and they say, well, it's just kind of more of this. There's communities that have been marginalized, that don't have access to this, that don't feel like they're being part of the decision making. I will note on this, the one big addition to this, while this is kind of building on some of the other programs that Governor Dayton had put in and a lot of private businesses had, we added geographic location to this for a very reason, that we have a lot of folks feel like in greater Minnesota they're being left out of the conversation. And what this basically does and means is that we're going to set some goals, and we're going to find some metrics to see if we're measuring them, and put best practices in place to make sure that all Minnesotans feel like they have a say in what happens. Yes, some of that's going to be racial, it's going to be ethnic, it's going to be religious, it's also going to be geographically, to make sure that folks feel like if you're in Halleck, you're not left out of all of the decision making, you're part of it too.
In the modern era, which you would maybe call the taconite era on the Iron Range, I don't think, short of Rudy Perpich, you'd find anybody who was as gifted a politician, as gifted a public servant as Tom Rukavina was. And also, I think even more than Rudy Perpich, what a Shakespearean character he was. Absolutely a raw nerve ending of a person who was so emotional and yet so smart and so loving, while also being so loud and rough. He's not like anybody I've ever met. I think somebody said if he wasn't yelling at you, he probably didn't like you. Most people who got to know him or work with him have experienced him upset about something that you say or did, or he disagrees with you perhaps. But he would also take the time to build those personal ties outside of the disagreement. And I think it's kind of funny, we in modern politics, we mourn the loss of civility, right? The loss of civility, and if only the two sides could get along better and be more civil to one another. But in a weird way, one of the least civil people that I ever knew, Tom Rukavina, was a good example of how that might actually work. And it has to do with getting to know people and actually understand them.
Time now for the business news from the editors at Business North. SHOPKO, which declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy this week, says it will not be closing any area stores. SHOPKO operates 6 stores in the region, including Duluth, Ely, Moose Lake, Two Harbors, Aiken, and Spooner. According to a list released by the company, 5 stores will close in Minnesota, including one in War Road. In Wisconsin, the retailer is closing 16 stores, but none in northwestern Wisconsin communities.
Grand Itasca Clinic and Hospital has announced the resignation of its president, Michael Yuso. Grand Itasca has tabbed Gene McDonnell as interim president when Yuso leaves in early April. Meanwhile, the board of directors of Mercy Hospital has named Yuso CEO effective April 2nd. Yuso is a Moose Lake native who will replace Michael Delps, who is leaving to serve as CEO of a medical center in his home state of North Dakota.
FRANDSEN Bank and Trust plans to purchase the Duluth banking operation of ALERUS Financial, including the branch office on West Superior Street. The company has announced the sale on Tuesday, noting ALERUS will close its Duluth Miller Hill branch. Grand Forks-based ALERUS expanded into Duluth in 2016 by purchasing Beacon Bank. The Duluth branch is led by Deb Otto, who also chairs the Duluth Area Chamber of Commerce Board. For more on these and other stories, visit businessnorth.com.
If you have a comment on our show, call now. Dial 218-788-2849 to leave a message or send an email to almanacnorth@wdsc.org. You can also visit the WDSC website for our program schedule, updates on your favorite shows, and the latest news and events at the station. And Julie, just when we were getting spoiled about above average temperatures, I guess it's back to the deep freeze.
That is right. My husband always says there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing.
There you go. I think so. For Julie and the crew at Almanac North, I'm Dennis Anderson. Have a great weekend. Good night, everybody, and be kind.